When we think of the first ruler of a unified Egypt, we often invoke the name Menes, the pharaoh who, around 3100 BC, united Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. In later Egyptian tradition, Menes is celebrated as the founding monarch of the first dynasty. Modern scholars generally identify Menes with the historical king Narmer. Narmer's victory palette shows him wearing both the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing unification. By all accounts, Menes was the pioneer of Egyptian kingship as we know it. However, despite being referred to as a pharaoh in modern sources, he would have been unfamiliar with the term. The word pharaoh, derived from an Egyptian word meaning great house, was not a title for the king in his time. Early Egyptian kings called themselves the Egyptian equivalent of king of Upper and Lower Egypt. The word that would develop into pharaoh at that time referred to the royal palace, not a person. It would be much more than 1,000 years after Menes before an Egyptian ruler would be addressed as pharaoh. Further, it may have been as much as 2,000 years later before a pharaoh was referred to as such in the exact way we do so today. The change came in the New Kingdom, running from the 16th to 11th centuries BC. Scholars suggest that Thutmose III, who ruled from 1479 to 1425 BC, may have been one of the first, if not the first, pharaohs to be referred to this way. However, from the context and evidence we have, it still remains unclear at this point if this was directly referring to him, or to the actual institution of Egyptian kingship. However, even if it wasn't a direct reference to Thutmose, it was reflecting a much greater reverence for the institution of the divine king. One reason that the term started coming into usage around this time is the increasing sanctity of the monarch's name. Egyptians held the king to be a living god, and over time it became somewhat taboo to speak the king's personal name casually. Referring to the sovereign indirectly as pharaoh, great house, was a respectful alternative, much like saying the crown instead of naming a king or queen. It also spoke to the institution of kingship as something greater than just one individual, again much like the term the crown. This practice echoed an old cultural attitude. For example, certain gods' names were not spoken aloud in ritual, and similarly, the god king's name was treated with reverence. By the reign of Akhenaten, pharaoh was commonly used to mean the king in written records. It appears in letters and inscriptions as a stand-in for the ruler, indicating that the usage was well established by that time. From then on, pharaoh effectively became a title of the monarch. Notably, for several centuries this title was used on its own. Egyptian texts would just say, "Pharaoh did something," without adding a personal name. Records don't describe Akhenaten as Pharaoh Akhenaten, but rather as Pharaoh or Akhenaten. The first pharaoh definitively referred to with the title followed by his name was Pharaoh Siamun, a ruler who reigned from 986 to 967 BC. That said, whether he was the first remains up for debate. He may simply be the first ruler we have definitive evidence of being referred to this way in official writings. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, be sure to mention any historical mysteries or controversies you'd like to see covered in the comments below. Now let's get back to business. Imagine the scorching sun over Saqqara, Egypt's vast city of the dead, where archaeologists brush away golden sand in search of a legend. They're hunting for the tomb of Imhotep, a man who lived over 4,600 years ago, yet whose genius still looms large in history. Imhotep wasn't a pharaoh, but his name echoes through time as priest, architect, physician, and later as a god of healing. Strangely, for all his renown, Nobody today knows where this brilliant figure's final resting place lies. His tomb remains one of Egypt's most interesting unsolved mysteries, one that has now eluded scholars from numerous civilizations for millennia. During the 27th century BC, at the dawn of Egypt's third dynasty, Imhotep rose from the ranks of commoners to become one of the most trusted advisors of Djoser. He bore lofty titles according to an inscription on Djoser's own statue base, a fact that perhaps makes him the first non-monarch recorded in history. These titles tell us that Imhotep was Djoser's chief minister, the high priest of the sun god's temple, and the kingdom's lead architect and builder. Such honors on a king's statue were unprecedented for someone not of royal blood, suggesting Imhotep was regarded almost as a member of the royal family. In fact, this has led some scholars to believe that he must be a relative of Djoser, perhaps his brother, though this is highly controversial. Imhotep's name literally means "he who comes in peace," and he certainly made his mark peacefully through construction and general wisdom. He's most famous as the master architect behind Pharaoh Djoser's tomb, the step pyramid at Saqqara, which was the first pyramid ever built in Egypt. Prior to Imhotep, Egyptian tombs for royalty were flat-roof structures made of mud brick called mastabas. Imhotep's breakthrough was to use stone as a building material on a massive scale. Around 2600 BC, he pioneered stacking mastabas in diminishing size, creating a six-tiered pyramid that soared roughly 200 feet high. By constructing Djoser's pyramid complex in limestone, Imhotep revolutionized Egyptian architecture. He effectively turned the pharaoh's burial site into an eternal palace of stone, ensuring King Djoser would be remembered as a god on earth. Notably, in a sense, this worked, because Djoser's name is still widely known today, even by those with only a passing interest in Egyptology. Imhotep lived a long life, apparently surviving Djoser and serving subsequent kings. His name even appears in the unfinished pyramid complex of Djoser's successor, Sekhemkhet, and records suggest Imhotep died in the reign of King Huni, the last ruler of the Third Dynasty. Notably, in modern times, Imhotep has attracted most of his attention for his architectural work, while to ancient Egyptians his status as a healer was of even greater renown. Interestingly, he's believed to be the first person in recorded history to record numerous diagnoses and the treatments for them. In short, Imhotep was a universal genius of the Old Kingdom, architect, engineer, priest, physician, and sage all in one. Imhotep's legacy didn't end with his death. In fact, it only grew. For the next 2 millennia, Egyptians revered Imhotep's memory so deeply that he was eventually deified. By the New Kingdom period, scribes worshipped Imhotep as the patron of wisdom. They saw in him the embodiment of intellect and learning. In the late period, from the 7th to 4th centuries BC, Imhotep's cult really blossomed. He was officially recognized as a god of medicine and healing. Temples were dedicated to Imhotep, priests served in his name, and people offered prayers for cures to illness. The Greeks who later occupied Egypt were so impressed by Imhotep's healing reputation that they linked him to Asclepius, their own god of medicine. Evidence of this posthumous fame is found throughout Egyptian history. In the Ptolemaic era, after Greek conquest, a famous inscription known as the Famine Stela imagines King Djoser appealing to Imhotep to save Egypt from a 7-year drought. Ironically, by this time, Imhotep's reputation had far exceeded that of his patron, as well as virtually every other ruler of Egypt. The Greek rulers of Egypt continued to build and patronize temples to Imhotep. It's unclear whether they recognized him as a real man who once lived, or a divine figure who walked the earth to assist the ancient Egyptians. In essence, Imhotep the man became Imhotep the myth, one of the very few non-royals in Egyptian history to be elevated to godhood. This extraordinary status is a testament to the impact he had on the Egyptian imagination. Considering Imhotep's towering reputation, one might expect his tomb would be a prominent monument at Saqqara. Ironically, however, Imhotep's tomb has never been found. For well over 150 years, Egyptologists have scoured the Saqqara necropolis and beyond, but the location of Imhotep's burial remains elusive. This missing tomb is more than just an archaeological curiosity. It's potentially a historical gold mine. If discovered intact, Imhotep's tomb could reveal priceless information about his life, his family, and his era. Personal inscriptions or artifacts from his burial would shed light on the man behind the legend, filling gaps in our understanding of Egypt's third dynasty. In other words, finding Imhotep's tomb could greatly enhance our knowledge of this important figure's life and career. It would also serve to peel back some of the layers of legend that were later overlaid on top of the historic individual. Scholars generally agree he was laid to rest somewhere in the vast royal cemeteries of Memphis, likely at Saqqara. Two main theories have emerged about the tomb's location. Some experts argue that because Imhotep was so closely connected to Djoser, he could have been interred in or near Djoser's own monumental enclosure. Imhotep is specifically mentioned by name on engravings at the site, though these talk about his accomplishments and don't specifically mention him being buried there. Djoser's complex was sacred ground, and later legends even suggest Imhotep might be hidden under or around the step pyramid itself. Notably, large sections of Djoser's complex remain unexcavated, leaving room for hope that Imhotep's tomb could lie concealed in those unexplored zones. Others believe Imhotep was given a grand tomb in the general cemetery for high officials of his time. North Saqqara is dotted with massive mastaba tombs of 3rd Dynasty nobles, some as big as small pyramids. Imhotep's resting place could be one of these large mud brick mastabas, or beneath one, awaiting identification. In fact, British archaeologist Walter Emery in the 1960s became convinced that a particular tomb, called 3518, in North Saqqara, was Imhotep's final resting place. This tomb had an unusually complex layout of chambers for cult rituals, and clay ceilings bearing King Djoser's name, which hints that someone of very high status was buried there. But more on Emery's search for Imhotep in a moment, since he did discover something else magnificent that is a potential clue to the location of the tomb. Some other scholars believe that Imhotep's tomb might have been discovered at some point in the past, but not recognized due to heavy damage or missing inscriptions. In short, under this theory, the famous tomb could be hidden in plain sight, an unassuming ruin already dug up but never linked to Imhotep because time erased its markers. Others believe that there's the potential that he wasn't buried in Saqqara at all, given that little is known about his early life. The quest to find Imhotep's tomb has led archaeologists down fascinating paths, sparking discoveries even when the prize itself stays out of reach. A dramatic chapter of this search began in the 1930s with Walter Emery, a renowned Egyptologist who dedicated years to hunting Imhotep at Saqqara. Emery had noticed a curious concentration of large ceramic jars and broken ibis bird mummies on the desert surface in part of North Saqqara. These ibises were sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom, a deity closely associated with Imhotep. The jars dated to the late period, many centuries after Imhotep's time, suggesting they were left by pilgrims visiting what they believed was Imhotep's burial site. Emery theorized that later devotees trekked to Imhotep's tomb to offer mummified ibises in his honor, leaving behind heaps of pottery. If his theory was correct, the tomb of Imhotep should lie nearby. Armed with this clue, Emery began large-scale excavations at North Saqqara in the 1960s. What he uncovered was astonishing, though not in the way he expected. Below the sand, Emery's team found a maze of underground catacombs full of animal mummies, a secret cemetery of ancient sacred creatures. There were tunnels filled wall to wall with ibis mummies in jars, others with hawks and falcons, and even areas for baboons and bulls. This turned out to be the sacred animal necropolis, an enormous religious complex from about 2,300 years ago, where people buried animals as offerings to the gods. Emery had stumbled on one of the most important late-period sites in Egypt. The discovery was a sensational find in its own right, shedding light on how ancient pilgrims worshipped Imhotep and Thoth with animal offerings. But amid all these mummies, Imhotep's personal tomb was still missing. Emery did identify the aforementioned mastaba as a strong candidate for Imhotep, though admittedly he couldn't prove it himself. His excavations there revealed those cult rooms and Djoser-inscribed ceilings, raising his hopes. Yet, frustratingly, no definitive proof emerged, and it's been suggested that the reason the site has so much related to Imhotep's life is because it was a devotional site rather than a tomb. It's necessary to keep in mind that the people worshipping Imhotep at this time were about 2,300 years removed from the life of the man himself. To put things in perspective, we're now about 2,300 years removed from the lives of those Imhotep worshippers. In 1970, as Emery continued digging in hopes of that breakthrough, he suffered a stroke at the site. He passed away in Cairo a few days later, ending his quest without the ultimate success he had sought. Emery's lifetime search for Imhotep had instead unlocked a different treasure, the vast animal cult complex, but the man he sought remained in the shadows. In the decades after Emery, various Egyptologists have revisited the search with fresh eyes and new technology. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified some intriguing anomalies under the sands of North Saqqara. There are hints of large rectangular structures that could be candidates for Imhotep's tomb. These buried structures, however, remain unexcavated, essentially X marks on a map awaiting future exploration. Thousands of years ago, Imhotep helped immortalize King Djoser by building a house of stone for his spirit. Yet Imhotep's own immortality has taken a different form. Not a known tomb or mummy, but a legacy of legend and a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The tale of Imhotep's tomb is a reminder of how much of the ancient past still remains hidden. The Saqqara bird is a small, carved wooden object that has captivated historians and aviation enthusiasts alike for over a century. Discovered in 1898 during the excavation of a tomb at Saqqara, this intriguing artifact dates back over 2 millennia to around 200 BC. It resembles a stylized bird, with outstretched wings measuring about 7 centimeters across and a lightweight body weighing less than 1/10 of a pound. Crafted from sturdy sycamore wood and originally mounted on a rod, the figurine immediately stood out as a curious find. At first glance, it seems like a simple bird carving, but its unusually plane-like form has puzzled and inspired speculation ever since. In form, it resembles a bird of prey. The carving is sleek and almost aerodynamic, with flat, horizontal wings as if poised in glide. The head is carved with a hooked beak, reminiscent of a falcon, a creature sacred to the ancient Egyptians. The tail is broad and level, though the artifact notably lacks legs or painted detail. Its craftsmanship is simple yet well-proportioned, suggesting the maker had a good sense of balance. Today, this little wooden bird is displayed in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, where its plane-like silhouette continues to fascinate visitors. Visitors can find it on the museum's upper floor among other animal figurines. Yet this particular piece stands out as a mystery of its own. Without inscriptions or records, archaeologists have had to speculate on why this miniature bird was made. One idea is that it served a ceremonial or symbolic function. Falcons were sacred in Egypt, representing sky gods like Horus and Ra, so a falcon-shaped figure could have been a ritual object or charm for protection. Another possibility is that it was a toy for a child of the elite. Under this theory, some have even likened it to a form that might glide when thrown, given that ancient Egyptians used such hunting tools for birds. Others suggest it functioned as a weather vane or was mounted on the front of a sacred boat during religious festivals. Any of these uses might fit its context in the Ptolemaic period, but without definitive evidence, they remain educated guesses. The sakura bird's fame grew largely due to a controversial idea that it was more than a toy or ritual figurine, that it was actually a model of an ancient Egyptian flying machine. This bold theory took off in the 1960s, when Khalil Massia, an Egyptian physician, suggested the wooden bird was a proof-of-concept glider. He pointed to its wing shape, arguing it could generate lift. The flat top of the tail, he believed, once held a tail stabilizer that later broke off. To test this, Massia built an enlarged replica with an added tail fin, and according to his reports, the model did glide when launched. This claim was met with some skepticism by the aviation community. Unfortunately, others tried to recreate his supposed experiment, and no one else could replicate the results. Aeronautical engineers who analyzed the artifact have noted practical problems. It's too heavy and unbalanced to glide effectively, especially since it lacks a tail rudder for stability. The academic community also greeted this ancient airplane theory with skepticism as well. No depictions or writings from Egypt hint at any attempt to fly, and a lone wooden model isn't proof of lost technology. All evidence to date suggests the artifact was never meant to be a serious flying device, but rather a static object with symbolic or practical purpose. Some fringe theorists even tied the sakura bird to ancient astronaut myths of extraterrestrial influence. Under this theory, the bird may not be proof that Egyptians themselves had the technology to fly, but may have been their attempt to explain what they saw. As mentioned, the sakura bird dates to around 200 BC in Ptolemaic Egypt. By this period, Egypt was fully enmeshed in the Hellenistic Mediterranean world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, had become the intellectual and commercial hub of the region, with the Great Library fostering rapid exchange of ideas and technologies. Had there been genuine evidence of flying machines or extraterrestrial visitors, Greek and Egyptian scholars would surely have recorded it in writings. This was a period where this knowledge would have circulated across Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The complete absence of such accounts in papyri, inscriptions, or classical literature makes the ancient astronaut explanation both unnecessary and unsupported. Despite decades of study, the sakura bird still remains an Egyptian enigma. That said, all evidence suggests that it was a much more grounded object than some would like to believe.